Welcome to Mormon Book Reviews, where an evangelical encounters the restoration. I'm your host, Stephen Heinecker, and I'm actually really stoked to have this guest on. I reached out, Jesse and I have been in communication with each other, Jesse James, and he's a fascinating dude. And he's got this thing that he's starting up, this book that he's working on, and this religious survey that I find is so fascinating. It really resonates with me. But before we get there, I just want to remind you that this month's book giveaway is Battlefields to Temple Grounds, Latter-day Saints in Guam and Micronesia, edited by my good friend, Devin Jensen. He gave me an extra copy when we had a last-minute meetup in Provo. And I said, you bring me 2 copies, I'll give one away. So I'm giving it away. So in the description is my email. And you send the email in the subject box, put in book contest, and then put in your name and address, U.S. residents only. The deadline's going to probably be April 31st. So that's where we'll go from there. So either way, Jesse James, dude, welcome to the program.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
And first of all, folks, we got to ask you about the name. Jesse James. First of all, it's a cool name, but did you ever go to your parents and say, what were you thinking? Or what was the idea behind naming you Jesse James?
Yeah, so my mom tells this story. I'm sure she's lying, but she's like, I just always loved the name Jesse, and I would have named my first boy Jesse no matter what my husband's name was. And I was like, yeah, but you didn't pause for a moment at any point in this process and say, like, was this still a good idea?
Yeah, the other part she didn't tell you was that she was also looking for a husband that had a last name James too. That's the other half.
She's like, I just always wanted to name my name Jesse James. Stick him up, like, come on.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So yeah, and so we've been in communication with each other, and you were telling me about this survey that you're putting together, this study, and it's called These Things Have Not Ceased is the name of what you're going to probably call the book. And you have this website called havenotceased.org, in which people can actually literally you're asking for people to give their personal narratives of spiritual experiences that they experience. So if you're at Latter-day Saints, and this is just for Latter-day Saints, right?
Yeah.
Could it be also people like Community of Christ or other people of the Restoration, or are we just doing Latter-day Saints?
Yeah, so I'm hopefully focused on those people that are part of the Brighamite branch.
Okay.
Because I'm not sure where we're gonna end up publishing it. And if it goes through like Deseret Book, for example, then I think they'll want it to be focused on members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. So
makes perfect sense. So folks, this is the thing. All right. Now, many of you probably saw my interviews on Mormon Stories, and actually I've got a publisher reach out to me based on those to write my book, and hopefully we'll get on that soon. But one of those things was before I started my channel, originally it was supposed to be a secular scholarly endeavor. Before I even started my channel, I had an apostle from one of the Restoration branches in Independence, Missouri, reach out to me and tell me about this individual named Arlene Buffington, who had these songs supernaturally downloaded, and she in her mind, and she couldn't carry a tune. I've heard her sing; she can't sing, and she can't read music, but yet she was getting these songs supernaturally downloaded, and she's with the Church of Jesus Christ, headquartered in Monongahela, Pennsylvania. Sometimes they're referred to as the Bickertonites. But as he's telling me these stories, you got to understand, I come from the charismatic renewal movement. So this story resonated with me, to have somebody have this like supernatural song, supernaturally inspired, like literally, it's an amazing story. And check my interview with Becky Tarbuck, who's Arlene Buffington's daughter. And so I'm listening to this story, and I usually pace, and when I'm talking on the phone, but I went and sat on my couch, and I had this big smile on my face. I thought, as he's telling me the story, I thought, oh no, this channel is going to be more than just secular and scholarly. It's also going to be spiritual. So it's the 3 S's: scholarly, secular, and spiritual, all in one. And so sometimes I have Latter-day Saints contact me and say, Steve, the reason I watch your program is that any minute the Holy Ghost is going to show up. So sometimes it turns out into a church service. But that's what makes this channel so unique, is that it's open to the idea that the Spirit could be involved in it. So now my channel becomes this different channel, in which it's going to, so often I watch a lot of secular type shows, whether it's within our podcast world or just in general. And if somebody says something about God or spiritual experience, the interviewer gets really nervous, and they don't even ask the follow-up question. I'm like, wait, hold on a second. Like when Denver Snuffer comes on my channel and says, I saw Jesus, I'm not like, oh, okay, whatever, Denver, I'm going to ask the next question. I'd be like, okay, what do you look like? What do you say? Now I'm more interested in that. And so that's what this channel has become. And so when I was talking to Jesse a while back, he brought this up to me. I thought, we need to have this conversation, because I think that I've had way too many spiritual experiences. You got to understand, I was an atheist for a long, long time. And it's only around COVID time where I'm starting to get rewired, where I'm starting to see things through a spiritual lens again. And then I start the channel. And I can honestly tell you that as the channel has progressed, it's also documenting my spiritual journey as well. And when I first started the channel, I was still thinking very much like a secular, naturalistic, materialistic person, right? So when something supernatural would happen, I would be like, okay, what was the naturalistic explanation of what happened? And often I could come up with a pretty good, plausible reason why this is a naturalistic argument. But I said after a few months of it, I just quit because it was happening too often. I thought, nah, this can't just be, there's something else. There's something else going on here. And off camera, I relayed to you a few things. First of all, there's other people that have spiritual experiences, people that you would not expect. For instance, one, John DeLynn, Mormon Stories, right? I know, very controversial dude, get it. But did you know that, and then we talked about on my podcast as well as on his when I was a guest, that in 2005, he was taking a walk, and he hears this voice tell him he needs to start a podcast. In 2005, who even had heard of a podcast? So John hears a voice, has some kind of, he says it, I don't know what to make of it. I can just tell you, I heard a voice tell me that I was supposed to start a podcast, Mormon podcast, right? And then I can tell you, I can't give you the details, but there's a Sandra Tanner, another person who had after Gerald Tanner died, she had what would be called a supernatural encounter. That's pretty remarkable. So these are people that I would still call Mormons, even though that they may, because they're steeped in this Mormon culture.
Yeah.
But I'm just telling you is that a lot of people have spiritual experiences. And that's one of the things that you talk about. Now, this is a long introduction, but I really feel like this is really important that we talk about these things because there, I can see how there's utility using a naturalistic explanation to say that the reason why, I always tell people the reason why we are here is because our ancestors believed, because they believed in something bigger than themselves. And rather than be selfish, they became selfless, taking out care of each other in the community and all this kind of stuff is what makes us human, which I consider that's the divine spark. That's the divine moment, is when we became self-aware, something bigger than outside of ourselves. We're more than just animals. We are inherently spiritual beings. So just from a naturalistic explanation, I think it's important that we stay tapped into our spiritual aspect as well. Now, this is a very long-winded thing. It's a preface. But I think, Jesse, I just want you to kind of riff on what I just said, and then I want you to kind of explain to the audience a little bit about your program. And I also want to talk a little bit about your past too, but just kind of riff on what I just talked about.
Yeah, exactly. So, one of the things that's so amazing about this is that, so when peer-reviewed scientists are publishing their work about this this field of, spiritualism and the psychology of religion and stuff like that, something like 30 to 40, it depends on how you ask the question, but something like 30 to 40% of Americans will say that they have had some kind of noetic, mystical, life-changing experience. And a lot of these people are not particularly religious. Many of them are atheist, and they're still having these kinds of deep spiritual experiences. Sometimes they feel like they can't explain it. They can't put it into their worldview, their framework. Sometimes they become converted because of it, to a religious framework. They are higher among religious individuals, and they're higher among certain personality types as well. And so there seems to be some kind of either a psychological disposition to hallucinating these experiences, or, in my opinion, more likely, just kind of like a personality type that makes one more sensitive to religion and spirituality generally, and also to mystical experiences in particular. And so, so we don't know how I have no peer-reviewed research that suggests how frequently these kinds of experiences are happening among Latter-day Saints. And we think that it's at least as common as among the general population of the United States, but I suspect perhaps more common because, one, we're religious and we have a mystical background, a really relatively recent background of mystical experiences that we hang our testimonies on. We believe in these kinds of angels and gold plates and seeing God and all these amazing kinds of things. And I think many Latter-day Saints have these kinds of experiences. I've heard stories from people who say that they've had these experiences, but we don't talk about them very often for a couple reasons. One of those reasons is we've been told that we are not supposed to that we're not supposed to make them public, that we're supposed to kind of hold them sacred to our chest. And I have some quotes that kind of address whether that's quite true or not. But the other reason, I think, is because we've got just a little bit of fear that people might think we're crazy. That's the kind of the broader cultural milieu in which we live, that people kind of look at these experiences, like if you see a dead relative, a ghost, or if you if you speak in tongues or something, it just seems really bizarre, and so people are a little bit hesitant to disclose that they've had these kinds of experiences. But one, like I remember hearing a story from a sociologist, Rodney Stark, who studies these kinds of experiences all the time. He would say that he would go to a conference and he would describe these kinds of things, and afterward, every single time, he'd have several people come up to him and describe how one time they were about to step into the road, and they just weren't paying that much attention, and they felt like a set of hands grab their shoulders and pull them back onto the sidewalk right as a bus flew by, and they look around and there's nobody there, right? It was invisible hands that just saved them from death. Or somebody would come up and say, I saw my deceased relative appear to me, and they're always afraid. They would say to Rodney Stark, "I've never told another soul this, but it feels like I could tell you because you just shared that this is normal and even common." And so I want this. What's going on here is a psychological theory called pluralistic ignorance, which is this idea that everybody's ignorant of each other's experiences because we all keep it secret. And I think one of the reasons why I want to write this book is to help us all know together that these aren't that rare, that we all have these kinds of experiences, and that we don't need to be afraid of sharing them. That it doesn't make us crazy, and it certainly it doesn't reflect poorly on us in any way. In fact, I would say it reflects very well on us to have these kinds of experiences, because the Book of Mormon and Mormon 9 and Moroni 7 suggests that you really ought to be having these kinds of experiences. If you're not having these experiences, the Book of Mormon suggests all these things, like if these things have ceased, then all is vain. Like everything else you're doing is useless if these miracles and these angelic visitations aren't happening. And so my thesis is, I think a lot of members might look at that and they might say, like, well, I don't know what to do with the fact that we have like a lack of gifts. And my thesis in writing this book is something along the lines of, it might be rare at the individual level, but if you step back and look at the population level of Latter-day Saints, I don't think it's rare at all. I think it might be, most individuals have had one or two experiences like this, but if you start adding those up across the whole population, then these things have not ceased.
Okay.
And so that's the point of my book.
That's fascinating. Yeah, no, very interesting. And it's interesting because, I tell people, I say, I can go to a Latter-day Saint and say, the God told me, or I'm impressed, or whatever. I can use this terminology, this language to Latter-day Saint, and they'll be like, yeah, God probably did. Whereas I go to a Presbyterian, they'll be looking at me sideways, like, I don't know about that, Steve. It's so funny because I come from two different backgrounds. So I come from a long line of Dutch Reformed on both sides of my family. Matter of fact, people realize, like, I'm related to Cornelius Van Til, one of the most important Christian theologians of the 20th century. So so we're stooped in like this really rigid Calvinistic world. And then in the 60s, my parents got involved in the charismatic renewal movement, and a lot of great stories came out of that. And then I was raised essentially as a charismatic Calvinist, because I actually attended a charismatic Calvinist school in South Holland, Illinois. South Holland, I mean, this is right in the middle of the Dutch Bible Belt, just outside of Chicago. And so many, especially very conservative Christian Reform members, actually ended up becoming charismatics in the 60s and 70s. So I have been steeped in this world, okay, of the gifts. I actually, when I was as a little kid, we attended a Baptist church on the south side of Chicago, in which they did deliverance, which they were doing exorcisms, okay, and so that's the world I grew up. So I'm like, I've been in. When I hear the early days of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, or Church of Christ at the time, having these supernatural experiences that are very similar to what I've experienced, I'm like, a lot of this resonates with me. But not only that, we have this young boy who at the age of 14 has some kind of spiritual experience. I tell people what would later be called the first vision, I would say it was probably a born-again experience. But apparently there were other people that were also having similar visions of Jesus, and seeing God and Jesus, and having these angelic visitations. And this is the world that he was steeped in. So, and that would be the evangelical world. Okay, so I tell people, if there's no evangelical world, there's no tent revivals, there's no second great awakening, there's no people having these visionary experiences, I don't know if Joseph Smith Joseph Smith would probably not exist as we understand it, because he understood that world. Is it, so I feel that there's so much that I feel like in the charismatic renewal movement and the evangelical movement as well, is because all the evangelical churches early on had spiritual gifts and manifestations, and all this kind of stuff was all happening. Everything, almost every evangelical denomination in this country that has had some kind of charismatic or Pentecostal beginning in one sense, the Methodists and all these other people. And so to me, it's like, this is part not only of the Mormon LDS experience, this is part of the American religious experience in total. I mean, I really think that this is American Protestantism. This is American evangelicalism, is that that it's all there. And so for me, but that's the other thing, is that even within the charismatic movement, they still kind of tamp down on some of this stuff. Well, maybe not, and so we still have this bureaucracy that kind of fights against the spiritual aspect of it too. So there's so many parallels between our movements. I find it, that's why I feel like I have a real resonance with the Restoration. I'm sorry, I'm really talking a lot today. I normally don't, but I'm very excited about this topic. So I wanted you to kind of just address what I just talked about.
Yeah. I think it's lovely how many things evangelicals and Latter-day Saints have in common. And if you look at the four major tenets of the anchor, the pillars of evangelicism, the one that we really I would say the only one that we don't share in common is sola scriptura, right? But if you look at these other tenets, I mean, we share way more in common than we don't share in common, but with evangelicals. And I think as I look at the history of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, I wish that we had kind of done a better job of keeping that Pentecostal charismatic heritage alive. It lasted for quite some time, but eventually, because of, I think, one of the theories that's really helpful in understanding like the shifts in denominations over time is the church sect theory proposed by Max Weber. And he suggests that as an institution becomes bigger and needs to like regularize a lot of decisions so that they don't have to approach every question individually and answer it time after time, we kind of end up regularizing out of a church a lot of the ways in which God might mysteriously work. And so like this is really evidenced in a typical sacrament meeting, where you go and it might have been led by the Spirit beforehand as you plan the meeting, but if the Spirit were to prompt somebody to like shift the agenda of the meeting, it would take a really strong prompting, I think, before somebody would be willing to like actually act on that. Because most of the time we just stick to what we planned, And I think I think there's there's nothing wrong with this, because God can inspire the agenda of the meeting in advance, definitely. But I just worry sometimes that we might be a little closed off to certain kinds of spiritual experiences and certain environments in which we could have those spiritual experiences. And I hope that, again, part of the goal of this book is to kind of open our minds so that we can do a better job of not putting God in a box, just recognize that there are so many diverse ways in which God works with people.
Have you ever been to a Church of Jesus Christ, a Bickerton night service?
I haven't. No, I would love to sometime. There's not a denomination close enough to me right now. So
yeah, they actually they are making plans to in Independence, Missouri, to start a branch eventually. So they actually got somebody ordained or ready to go there. But what was so fascinating to me was the very first church service of the Restoration I ever attended was in May of 2021, a week before Mormon History Association. I attend the Bickerton night service, and then a few weeks later, I attended Rick Bennett's ward in Lehi, Utah. And what I saw was the form was very similar. They kind of follow like the same type of pattern. But what makes the Bickerton night services, they have this basic outline, but they feel like the Holy Spirit has to fill in everything else before, like as the meeting is almost going on, like 5 minutes before the main service starts, they don't even know who's going to give the sermon. Or 5 minutes before, they might determine, okay, brothers, which one has a word from the Lord today, and then they don't plan the songs.
Wow.
They somebody just said, okay, let's sing hymn number such and such out of the Songs of Zion, and it's just remarkable to see. And then I went to, and it was vibrant. The testimonies literally was like over half the congregation stood up It was at least 45. They sometimes last like 45 to 60 minutes of people asking for prayer or miracles that have happened in their lives. I've been in one service where the guy said, and I, brother so-and-so, I saw an angel by you when you were speaking today, that kind of thing. So they have
Yeah.
all this stuff, which is really fascinating to me. And then I went to the Lehigh ward and I'm like, and these people could use a cup of coffee was my first reaction. It was so quiet. It was like, and they're singing the hymns and it's like just above a whisper. I'm like, boy, I've
Yeah.
never heard it so
Yeah.
quiet in the service
I
before.
have literally been to dozens and dozens of churches, because I'm fascinated by the diversity across Christianity, and I
Yeah.
love worshiping with my fellow Christian cousins, and I just have to say, like, I wish that we all did a better job of emulating each other. That I think
Huh.
that there are really good things in each denomination, but like I don't think there's anything wrong with having a place for reverence like we do in the
Yeah.
Latter-day Saint Church. Though I will also say I think there's a place for like the enthusiasm of an evangelical service, and I think there's something really beautiful and transcendent in the high church of of the Catholics and the Episcopalians who have like the pomp and circumstance that leads your mind upward to kind of feel this sense of awe and grandeur. And I think there's a place for all of this kind of stuff, and maybe not all the time, but like I wish we did a better job of incorporating elements from all the different faith traditions.
I agree. And just you said visit dozens of churches. You've been to like a charismatic or Pentecostal
Yeah,
services?
yeah.
Tell me a little bit about them.
Oh goodness. It, to be completely authentic, I just have to say, it wasn't my cup of tea. Like it was just a little out there for me. But this was when I lived in Ogden. I went to a church in downtown Ogden, and there was the preacher stood up and he became more and more animated through the course of the sermon, and by the end he was jumping up and down and just screaming at the top of his lungs about about the saving power of Jesus. And the thing that was so beautiful in the service to me, I mean, they did an altar call and people spoke in tongues, and I mean it was the whole thing, but the thing that was so beautiful to me about the service was the people in attendance were enormously varied racially and economically in their backgrounds, and there were a lot of people there that I could tell had walked a hard life. They were like recovering from gang activity, recovering from drug abuse, recovering from just abusive backgrounds, all kinds of really hard lives, but also sitting right in the pews, right next to each other, sitting next to people who were from very radically different backgrounds. And they were worshiping together, and they were in this place where the Holy Spirit was working on them in a way that I felt like on that Sunday, I don't know that the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints could really touch all these people the same way that this church is. Like it felt like it was able to reach further down into the depths of despair than the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints would typically be able to. We kind of have like a typical basic expected standard of behavior and kind of like a level of executive functioning that's required in order to participate. You have to be really pretty responsible and self-reliant to make it in the LDS church.
Yeah.
And this church that I went to in downtown Ogden, it didn't feel that same way. It was like the power of Christ was deep enough to save everyone there no matter what. And that was a really beautiful thing.
Reminded that as you're telling me that story, I'm reminded. And by the way, when we get off camera, I want you to tell me what church that was you went to. But my friend Christopher Thomas, when he's ever out there, because when he does work for the Maxwell Institute, he wrote the Pentecostal Reads, the Book of Mormon, and he sometimes attends this church service, I believe in downtown Salt Lake, which is for the homeless. And literally, he said, I get blessed every time I go there. He said, it's homeless people, and one of the things is they all can bring their stuff into the congregation. Imagine that happening in the LDS ward, bringing their shopping cart in the church service.
Yeah.
That's a world that's so outside of foreign to the Latter-day Saint world. And this is in the shadow of the temple, and you have this little church that lets come as you are. Homeless people, you need a place too. And so I really wish that in my mind, I really wish that the church would be more open to doing that kind of thing too. You know what? Bring
Yeah.
your shopping cart. I don't care what you look like. Come as you are.
Yeah.
You're welcome,
And
right?
I think, to be fair to us, I think that we aspirationally would say that we would be like that. Like, if that
Okay.
were to happen, if somebody came in, I think we wish we were the kind of people that would not blink an eye, that would just be welcoming. But I think it would be really difficult for somebody like that to feel at home in a
Right.
Latter-day Saint service because of our very elevated dress and manner of speech and the reverence and the cleanliness of our buildings. And there's just a lot going on there that would kind of prevent somebody from feeling at home, and it's so foreign to us that it might be difficult. It might take us a moment to figure out, how do I
Yeah.
really make this person feel welcome, you know? So I think aspirationally we want to be like that. And I think it's not that we couldn't, you know, it's just that it would perhaps be harder than for some other denominations.
Yeah, no, and let's be fair. There are plenty of other evangelical churches that would be just as imposing to somebody like that, that they wouldn't feel
Yeah.
welcome at too. So I'm not picking on the church. So I just want to kind of delve a little bit into what you're working on. The idea is that you're going to one do a survey of members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, surveying them on their personal religious experiences, and you also are looking for like people to give experiences. Maybe you could give some examples of some of the spiritual experiences that you've been hearing about, and just talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thanks. I would really love to. So, but before I do, I'll just touch on this idea that you just suggested. Like, as part of this book, I'm going to be fielding a survey and also soliciting people's narratives of the kinds of spiritual experiences that happen to them. And in order, see, I'm a survey researcher by profession. So my PhD is in psychology, and I study these kinds of spiritual experiences mostly through survey and also through interview means. But in order for the survey to be representative of Latter-day Saints generally, it has to be by invitation only. So I'm going to work with a contract agency to field that survey among a panel of people that they've already collected who are Latter-day Saints, so that whatever proportions that we compute from the survey about these kinds of spiritual experiences in people's lives, that those are representative of Latter-day Saints generally, even though it's it could be a relatively small sample of, between 500 and 1,000 people. It could represent millions of Latter-day Saints if it's a representative sample. And so for that reason, like, people who are listening to the podcast won't be able to just hop on and take the survey. But what I would love is for people to kind of, as prompted by the Spirit, reflect on their lives and think about the really impactful and magnificent, extraordinary spiritual experiences that they've had, and think whether there are any that they wouldn't mind sharing for inclusion in the book. So if they have some, they can go to havenotceased.org and kind of describe their narrative in the submission form there. But yeah, I'll give some examples that I've heard through the years as I've studied this area and talked to people that are close to me, my family members, people in my ward, friends, and things like that. But like, going way back in time, one of the earliest psychologists to have ever existed was William James. He was the father of American psychology, and he wanted to study this kind of like I do, a little bit more scientifically. And what he did was fascinatingly, he collected stories from people who, in a time when, like, this is the late 1800s, early 1900s. So communication takes a long time. There's no such thing as email, right? If you want to send a letter, it takes several weeks to get, across the ocean to, to the continent or whatever. And so, and a lot of immigrants had separate families. So people would, like, your extended family might live in the UK and you might live in America. And if your family died in the UK, it would take a long time before you would receive news of that death, right? Well, in William James' day, he was interested in studying this phenomenon whereby people after death appear to loved ones, like a ghost or a spirit or a physical apparition, something like that. And he collected all these kinds of stories from people who said this exact thing happened to me. But the amazing thing was, back in William James' day, because communication took so long, the death could occur and that person could appear before the person had intellectual news of the death. So there's no psychological explanation here. You can't say, like, oh, well, you knew about the death and therefore you imagined this person appeared to you, right? If the person died and that same night they appeared to you in your bedroom and you live a continent away, then there's no psychological explanation for that. And so what William James did was he collected these stories where people had written in their journal about an apparition. Somebody appeared to them, visited them right after their death, wrote about it in their journal, And then they heard news of the death officially sometime later. It might be like the next day, or it might be a couple of weeks later, or whenever it was, but they heard about it later. And so he took these, he collected all kinds of stories, even if they didn't fit that criteria. But for inclusion as scientific evidence of the afterlife, he only included those narratives. And out of tens of thousands that he collected total, there were about 950 or so, something like, I can't remember the exact number, but it was nearly 1,000 instances of people who had just that thing happen. A loved one appeared to them. He wrote about it. They wrote about it in their journal, and then they heard about the death at some point later. And so that suggested to William James, like, these kinds of metaphysical experiences can be studied scientifically. And I find that like a heritage worth preserving. Like that kind of like that way of doing science is a really beautiful way of doing science. And so even though we don't have because of the rapidity of communication today, we can't collect examples that are exactly like the ones that William James collected. But many people have examples from their lives that feel undeniable to them, that feel like there's no scientific or naturalistic explanation for this kind of thing. And those are the experiences that I'm personally most interested in, because it feels like this is an undeniable kind of manifestation of God, you know?
Wow. And so I guess I just have to ask you, like, because I still think naturalistically. I would say I still am grounded in naturalism in many ways, but is open to the idea of the supernatural as well. Do you feel like when you read about these experiences and you're doing your research, that here you are, you're doing it in the science as a science, but as a believer, does it actually help inform your faith and strengthen it?
Yeah. So I have a couple of informative quotes about this, because it's really this is one of the things that when I talk to people about this, they often get hung up on first. A lot of people are worried about like these kinds of experiences being abused or misunderstood by unbelievers or things like that, and so we want to keep them sacred. We don't want them to like get out and mocked or something like that. But it's my personal opinion that these kinds of experiences are intended to be bolstering experiences from God to those who already believe, to those who are already faith-filled. They're like confirmations. They're to use an analogy from the Old Testament, they're like a wet fleece or a dry fleece. You know, there's this beautiful experience of like a tender mercy that God manifested to you in a way that speaks to you, and might not, it might not speak to an unbeliever, but to other believers, you can see that and you can feel the Spirit kind of confirm that's a true thing. So to that end, one of these quotes that I have collected to kind of speak to this is from Dallin H. Oakes. He says, "There are times when the Spirit prompts us to share these experiences, sometimes even in a setting where our account will be published to strengthen the faith of believers. Because we recognize that, that when we already believe, that these kinds of experiences can be very confirming, very bolstering to our faith." Brigham Young also said, "Extraordinary manifestations of the power of God are not for the unbeliever. They are to console the saints and to strengthen and confirm the faith of those who love, fear, and serve God." So I think these narratives can't prove anything necessarily, because there are naturalistic explanations. These naturalistic explanations, honestly, because I have a PhD in psychology, and because I'm trained in naturalistic philosophy, they're competing all the time for real estate in my brain. It feels like sometimes I wish I could turn that off a little bit and be a little more faith-filled. But when I read these kinds of experiences, when I talk to people about them, I find that my faith is strengthened, and that despite the kind of that competing that competition between a spiritualistic and a naturalistic framework, I find that my spiritual side ends up winning out. And so I'm really grateful for the people who have shared these experiences with me through the years. I think they can remain personal and sacred even when they're shared to inspire others.
Fascinating. I got this book. I don't remember the name of it. Patrick McKay. Healing the Breach by Patrick
Oh,
McKay.
yeah. I haven't read it, but I've heard of this book. Yeah.
It's interesting. It's worth checking out because it's full of different spiritual experiences from all the different manifestations of the restoration,
Yeah.
miracle stories, pretty remarkable stuff. And I'd say disproportionately in that book, even though he's not a member of that church, disproportionately, I'd say the Bickertonites are overrepresented in the book because they have
Yeah,
so many stories like that, which is pretty amazing.
yeah,
And I do find it fascinating because like I was an atheist for like 10, 12 years, whatever, atheist agnostic for a period of time in my life, right? And I did speak in tongues when I received baptism of the Holy Spirit when I was in fourth grade. Okay. Now that was good enough for me to in early 20s. Like that, I had a testimony that was pretty etched. Like I felt the creator of the universe touch me. I felt touched, that I had this remarkable, powerful thing happen to me and didn't have expectations of speaking in tongues when I came up there. It actually shocked me. It surprised me. And then I was slain in the spirit. I fell to the ground. It was a pretty powerful thing. It's the only time it's ever happened. I haven't spoken in tongues since. But then you hear all the stories and sometimes like I have to say sometimes you hear the stories and then you meet the person and you realize, well, maybe that story wasn't as remarkable as the story I heard about them, right? So I would run into that quite a bit as well. So I'd always had this internal battle of then really like as a charismatic, but then really started questioning a lot of this. And I still think it's important to because I do think that there's plenty of people that fake this stuff. There are plenty of stories that are not true. There are people that use these kind of things to manipulate people. We can see this with many of just the Elmer Gantries of this world, right? And I know him. I personally know many televangelists because I live in a Christian community in which Benny Hinn got his start here. So I'm tied. I got job offers from televangelists in the past. So I also recognize like I also know how the sausage is made too. So I'm kind of dealing with in both realms, but I'm also highly skeptical of what people tell me. But I just tell people this and say, listen, me from like 3 or 4 years ago, everything that I would say as to why I believed in God would be like, oh, come on, that's weak sauce, or that's not going to do it for me. And I'm like, old Steve Pinecker, I completely get why you would be highly skeptical of this Steve Pinecker. But it's been an experiential thing. So I can't really go to an atheist and say, well, let me tell you why I believe in God. And I just tell them like personal spiritual experiences I had. They ain't gonna work for them. But I can also tell you that it worked for me because it did change me.
Yeah.
And now I'm much more open to the divine and the supernatural than I ever was. And it's so fascinating because it's within the context of also engaging the restoration that I'm doing this as well. And one of the cool things is, and I was talking to Kyle Bashirs about this, and he's really tied in with the Strangites, Dr. Kyle Bashirs, and he's a Baptist minister. And I said, one of the beautiful things that we get to experience as friends, people who are friendly to the restoration, even though we're outsiders, I said, we get to hear the stories that they don't tell the world. I said, the restoration people, members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, will tell us their spiritual experiences or want to hear about ours. I told Kyle, I said, we get to see the pearls of the restoration that the Christian apologists and the anti-Mormons will never see. And I think that's really important. So I've had the privilege to hear the stories that they don't talk about publicly.
Yeah.
And I tell other charismatics, you understand something. They don't talk about a lot of this stuff. But I said, there's stuff that goes on that I still can't quite explain and wrap my head around as an outsider, because theologically this shouldn't be happening.
Yeah.
But it's happening. Speak to that.
Yeah. Well, so one of the things that you said suggested to me a memory of a person that you had mentioned, like sometimes you meet one of these people who tells you a story and you're like, oh, I'm a little more skeptical of this story now. And this has happened to me a couple of times where I found that like I'm hearing of I'm speaking with somebody about their spiritual experience, and I realize at some point in the conversation, as I'm probing and asking follow-up questions, that they might be using inflated language. Like at one point, somebody told me about a visitation that they'd had from an angel, and then eventually I realized it was more of a vision of an angel, and then I realized it was probably more like a spiritual dream of an angel. And I'm a faith-filled person. I believe in the importance of spiritual dreams. But I think it's important that we use language in a precise way to describe what happened to us, so that as we share these faith-filled experiences with each other, the Spirit can testify of the truth of them, right? Because if we're using inflated language to describe what happened, just so that the story sounds more impressive, maybe so we think it's more believable. It actually might be less believable because the spirit might not confirm the truth of that if we're kind of exaggerating what happened in our experience. So it's really important to me, as as I interview people and also as they submit their narratives for use in the book, that people try to be as accurate as possible and detailed in what happened to them, but without ever exaggerating.
Yeah, I think that's important. Yeah, and I'm really careful because I've experienced that. I've seen stories get inflated as time goes on. So I really am trying my best that when I tell my stories, when I try to make sure that I'm telling the same story and I'm not adding to it.
Yeah.
I do think, like, yeah, are we backdating things? Are we building a story and making it even grander? And so I thought I got to be so careful to just try to stay bare bones
Yeah.
in what
Sometimes
I'm doing.
I mess up even without intending to, and I'll go back to my journal and reread what happened the day of or the day after when I wrote about it first, and I'll be like, whoa, I just told that story yesterday, and what I told was not what I wrote, and so that
Yeah,
because as a psychologist, I recognize the fallibility of memory. It's a reconstruction every time we tell something.
yeah.
It's not that we're intending to lie or intending to inflate, but sometimes it gets away from us because we misremember what's going on, especially the longer time passes. And so it's important, I think, to kind of reground ourselves in what originally happened, so that always that remains true. Though I should say also, our interpretation of that original event can change over time as we grow and alter our own faith and testimony. Our understanding of what happened might alter. The actual events shouldn't change, but our understanding of the meaning of it, what it reflects for our lives, why God might have given it to us, that can change.
And we can see that played out with the first vision.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. That's a
We can
great
almost
example.
document the progression of that story, right? And
Yep.
yeah, fascinating
Yeah.
stuff. And so I want you to continue to talk a little bit about this because because then there's the naturalistic thing too, where, like, for instance, when you're talking about, like, I felt something pulling me back, right? Well,
Yeah.
the skeptic in me is like, subconsciously, I would say most likely what happened on the naturalistic explanation is that we
Yeah.
don't understand the subconscious as much as we don't realize subconsciously what's going on, that you may have not perceived it, but subconsciously it did pick up that you're about ready to walk into that buzz, and it
Yeah.
manifested itself in a physical manifestation like that. So I do think, like, there's a definite naturalistic explanation that would explain why that would happen. So I imagine
Yeah.
you just have to keep on balancing that, like, oh, well, that's an interesting story. However, we do find out that our subconscious picks up a heck of a lot more than what we
Yeah.
realize as well.
Indeed, yeah. If you look at the cortex, like the conscious processing of our brain is something like an estimated between 1 and 6 millimeters thick at the outside layer of our brain, and everything else in the rest of that deeper brain, everything outside of that 1 millimeter thick layer is subconscious. It's processing that takes care of our automated thinking and automated movements and body regulation and all kinds of things, but it's mostly outside of our conscious awareness. And so what that suggests is, like, most of what we do is dictated by areas that we don't have conscious access to. So definitely the prevailing naturalistic explanations for these kinds of experiences is always like, we don't get the brain, like it could have been from the brain. And sometimes you read a really compelling paper where you can naturalistically manipulate these kinds of experiences to occur. Like, you can create spiritual experiences in the laboratory using what they called sometimes like the God helmet. This hasn't always been replicated well, but the original researchers who created the God helmet are still selling devices that can be used in to like facilitate your meditative practices or something, because it's supposed to help boost your feeling of spirituality. And I just, like, my personal opinion about that is twofold. One, I think that just because you can naturalistically or artificially create such experiences doesn't mean that they can't also spontaneously happen from God. Like, God can also create such experiences, even if they can be, naturalistically, artificially created. But the other thing that I think is, I always go back to this quote that I read in one of Terrell Given's books, Terrell and Fiona. I think this one was in The God Who Weeps. He describes how God intended for kind of like the faith and intellect to be in balance, And there's never a time in which the faithful explanation is so compelling that it completely outweighs the naturalistic one. If it were so, then it wouldn't be faith. Like, you can't have faith if the supernatural explanation is so compelling that you no longer have to feel a little bit of doubt, feel tenuous about this. If you know it for sure, then it's no longer faith. And so I think God really did intend for these two explanations that we have for these kinds of experiences to be approximately as compelling as each other, so that you could have faith or you could not have faith, and it's up to you. It's a choice. And I choose to make that choice every day on the side of faith.
Yeah, and actually, one of the things you talk about too is just the variety of the different religious experiences, and that how you shouldn't put God in the box as it pertains. Because I do think that, yeah, there's so much that can be said what you just said, because, like, if it's all internal, that's one thing, it's a naturalistic explanation. But I always tell people that we are both physical, material beings, but we also are spiritual beings. So there would have to be some kind of physical aspect of us that would have to be able to receive spiritual things. And then of course the experiences are all going to be different, because they're going to also be done, it's going through our filter. So I tell people is that the moment you experience something divine, the second you start talking about it, you corrupt it.
Yeah. That's really insightful. It's one of the most fascinating things in this field of the psychology of religion and spirituality is how cross-culturally different these kinds of experiences are. Like, somebody in the United States will often have a spiritual experience in which they encounter a vision of Jesus, but somebody in Nepal will have a vision in which they encounter the Buddha. And it's like that cultural filter is kind of overlaid on top of whatever spiritual experience was given to them, perhaps spontaneously by God. Like, you can't separate yourself sometimes from that filter, from your expectations of what a spiritual experience ought to look like. And so we often see that what a spiritual experience looks like is different for Pentecostals than it is for Latter-day Saints, because these religious denominations expect very different things from a spiritual experience. Like, for instance, Latter-day Saints will talk about the gift of tongues as being like a gift that strengthened their ability to learn a natural language on their mission. And I think that really does happen. I really do. I didn't experience it firsthand because I served an English-speaking mission, but I really, like, my wife, for example, she served a mission in Taiwan, and she's completely tone deaf, but that's a tonal language, and it's a very difficult language for most people to learn, even if they're not tone deaf, because that language uses tones in a linguistic fashion rather than a paralinguistic fashion. And if you're trying to learn it, it means that you're rewiring your brain. But for the fact that, like, for my wife to be able to learn that language, tone deaf as she is, in a relatively short period of time, I really do think God helped her. But I also think that that's not the only potential manifestation of the gift of tongues, right? I think the Pentecostals sometimes feel it too, authentically, for real. And so I think, like you were saying, sometimes we try to put God in a box, and I worry a little bit about doing that. And so I actually have, on the website, I've brainstormed a list of possible experiences that that people might have had. They can kind of look through that list, and it can trigger some ideas for them. I'll give a couple here just as examples, but as you listen, just think about, like, the kinds of spiritual experiences that you've had, but also open your mind to the kinds of experiences that God might have given in you if you weren't closed off to them through the years, So some people feel like they've witnessed a coincidence that was so unlikely that they sensed God must have orchestrated it to their benefit. Or sometimes they might, like, supernaturally know something that they couldn't have possibly naturally known. In fact, this happened to a close friend of mine at one point. She was in the temple, and when she went up to go to the veil, a person spoke to her. One of the workers spoke to her and said, this is a worker completely unknown to her, and she said, your mother wants you to know that she loves you. And this person's mother had died when she was very young. This worker could not possibly have known the situation with my friend, and yet the Spirit made known to them something that they needed to say that they couldn't possibly have naturally known. Another example might be, like, if you're led to prophesy of something in the future. We don't do this a lot as Latter-day Saints. some of us might have felt this from time to time. I remember one particular time in my life when I felt led to prophesy something in the future, and confusingly, it didn't happen. And so, like, sometimes we have these experiences where like we feel like God was involved, and then later we're trying to interpret, like, why did God work in this way when it feels like things didn't happen the way that it felt like God was meant to work out. And so those experiences are valuable too. And I hope if you've had those kinds of experiences that you'll also submit those for inclusion in the book, because we can have a chapter on these kinds of experiences that are a little confusing and hard to make sense of, and it helps flesh out like the whole understanding of how God sometimes works in really inscrutable ways that we can't understand. Another example might be like speaking the words God gave you, like you open your mouth and it felt like what came out was not from you, it was, God speaking through you. Or some people have described these experiences where they feel like they met somebody who they thought was one of the three Nephites who never tasted death and still roamed the earth. Sometimes people will have like a near death or an out of body experience, or they might feel what's described in the Doctrine and Covenants as a burning in the bosom. It might be a literal burning in the bosom. It might feel like an actual fire in your chest. I've heard some people describe that they have had like waves of electricity flush through their body, or that they felt like uh, like almost like God anointed them with hot oil that like kind of like flowed down through their whole body and just filled them. These kinds of really sensory experiences that don't seem to have any kind of, they're very rare, and they don't seem to have any kind of obvious explanation for where they're coming from, but they seem to always be accompanied by a strong sense of God's love, and sometimes also other thoughts as well, like maybe that you're purified, cleansed from sin, or like a direction for your life or something like that. But oftentimes it's just a sense of like God's unending love for you, like incomprehensible love.
Yeah, no, that's pretty remarkable to hear these kind of stories. And and again, from our side, similar things. And
Yeah.
I will also say that even people from more conservative groups that might be cessationist or don't believe in the gifts, they'll admit that they've also had experiences that they can't quite explain too. So it's not just it's all, it seems to be kind of universal. And what's so amazing is that it often is like they knew it was of God, which I find so fascinating. Let's talk also this idea within the context, of course, we have the idea of free will within the context of the restoration of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. We have the idea of free agency. Maybe talk about how that can be addressed with all these experiences as well.
Yeah. Well, the naturalistic explanation of our actions is largely taken by neuroscientists to be that free will doesn't exist. If you look, if you look at the research, the neuroscience in the brain suggests that our brain knows things that we ourselves consciously don't know, that that there are predictors, neurological predictors of behavior that are occurring deeper in the brain before we are consciously aware of having made a choice or intending to do an action. And the fact that that exists in the brain as a precursor before our own conscious knowledge of the choice to make, to engage in a particular action, suggests that maybe it's actually our subconscious that's deciding everything, and we're like post hoc feeling, like overlaying a sense on top of that we chose to act in that way, but really maybe the choice was made before we ever consciously recognized that we were going to make that choice. It's problematic to me that that if you end up believing in that theory of agency, that we, in essence, that we don't have free will, that your life ends up falling apart. Like, a lot of people will feel nihilistic, and they'll just kind of start acting like, well, if I don't have free will, then nothing matters, and it doesn't matter what I do, and they just kind of like sit in their lives, start rotting. So whether or not free will is a true principle, whether it really exists or not, believing in free will is a very useful theory. Like, it's very useful to believe you are an agent that can act, because when you believe that, whether or not it's true, you end up acting in more positive, pro-social and self-serving ways, both. Like, you end up just having a better life. And I often use this as an analogy for myself when I am tempted between these two explanations about God, where maybe this naturalistic explanation is really compelling, and maybe the spiritual thing wasn't really triggered by God. Maybe it was, maybe it was naturalistic. In cases like that, I always come back to this analogy of free will, and I try to remind myself that even if I'm wrong, I'm kind of engaging in Pascal's wager here. Even if I'm wrong, it's more useful to believe in God. It's a beneficial choice in my life to continue to believe in both free agency and in God, because my life is better when I do.
Yeah, I think that's so. There's a practicality here too. So I do get occasionally atheists going after me. I'm like, oh, I get why you're there. I tell people I'm a pro-atheist evangelical. I understand even the therapeutic value of atheism, especially for those who have experienced spiritual and religious trauma, spiritual abuse, and all this kind of stuff. I can see why they would have to cut themselves off from anything and everything that's supernatural because of the pain and the triggering that happens in their life. But that's a place you can be at for a while, but I don't recommend you stay there. I also think that you should just also realize that, yes, that I experienced PTSD, religious abuse. I experienced all these things as well. So I totally get it. And I also can tell you that atheism was very useful and helpful to me. That's why I had Aaron Ra on my program, one of the biggest atheists on YouTube. And I remember sitting there having him on. I'm like, oh, this reminds me of the good old days when I would hang out with my homies, the atheists on YouTube, and they would really help me out. And it was like, yeah, I get that. I get that. I don't agree with the tactics a lot of these atheists use, but that's fine. I mean, they're doing their thing too, And so like so those of you who are critical, you have to realize that there is utilitarian, that there's usefulness to believing in free will, to believing in supernatural. I do think that what we need to fight against, where I think we can work hand in hand with, are those who would abuse the spiritual aspect of us, take advantage of it, and use it to defraud people, to hurt people, to abuse them, make them do terrible things in the name of God. That to me is what we need to address, not the individual beliefs of an individual and how it helps them as well. What do you say to that?
Yeah, I think it's really important that insofar as it's possible, we discern accurately where God really is working and where he isn't. If, for example, some preacher is using crowd manipulation techniques, or just healing through adrenaline, and these healings don't stick, these are the kinds of things where you feel like even if it is impressively spiritual in the moment, if it's not really God working, then you really ought to be able to discern that and kind of dismiss that as an artificial representation of God. But you can only know for sure, well, I don't think you can ever know for sure that God is working in any particular situation, but you become more confident that God is working in a situation when you can dismiss the examples of times when he really wasn't working. And so that's one of the reasons why I continue to study from a naturalistic perspective all the different possible explanations for these experiences, because I don't want to be taken in by fake spiritual experiences that aren't legitimate, that aren't real, that aren't God working in people's lives. Because insofar as people are sharing those kinds of experiences and trying to promulgate them as compelling evidence, if they're connected with false beliefs, or if they lead me down a road that brings me further from God, then I don't need that, right? And so I think it's really important that we be good discerners of truth, and one of the ways that you can do that is understanding how those naturalistic experiences can cause artificial feel artificial spiritual experiences that feel real but really aren't actually triggered by an authentic divine being.
Yeah, and I think it's important. I think we can differentiate. I think sometimes it's almost too obvious, and even the atheists will point out the obviousness of it. And I'm like,
Yes.
I think, well,
Try to
that's
dismiss the authentic ones by pointing to the fake ones and saying, like, look, if you can do it, if you can make this fake experience, then all of them must be fake. And I'm like, I don't think that's true.
Yeah, I agree with that entirely. So you sent me this. Neil Maxwell said, for a disciple of Jesus Christ, academic scholarship is a form of worship. One who seeks to be the disciple scholar will take both scholarship and discipleship seriously. And that seems to be your working mantra. That's how you want to go about this, correct?
Indeed, yeah. So actually, for my work, I work for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I work in the Correlation Research Division. We do survey work and interviews and focus groups and stuff like that, secondary data analysis, statistics on member records and things like that, to answer questions that the brethren have for us. And I feel like my work in my everyday life is very devotional. This project, of course, is independent from that. It's it's just what I'm doing in my free time on the side. It's not affiliated with my formal role as a church employee, but But I feel like when I do these kinds of studies that interrogate our spiritual experiences, when I understand the lived religious experiences of members, I feel like it's devotional for me. I feel like it brings me closer to God in some ways, that it helps me to understand better how He works in people's lives. And I find it personally very fulfilling and very beautiful.
So I just want you to maybe just summarize what you're doing here. The proposed title of the book is "These Things Have Not Ceased." Talk about your website and how people can reach you, and also if they want to make donations to this project as well.
Thanks. Yeah. So, like I said earlier, we have, both a survey component and a narrative component. And the survey component is going to be, by invitation only. So you don't need to really worry about that. But if you feel led by the Spirit, if you can think of these kinds of experiences that you've had in your life and you'd like to share them, then go to havenotceased.org. And on there, they use lots of prompting examples of the kinds of experiences we might be talking about, definitions of certain terms that we might have used if they were unfamiliar to you, quotes from these church authorities who have suggested that it's okay to share these kinds of experiences as long as we're doing it in faith-filled ways. Then again, if you feel led by the Spirit, please submit your experiences and share them with us for potential inclusion in the book. I also have a tab on the website where people can make donations. The survey component, because it's contracted out, is going to be a very expensive thing to do. You have to pay per complete. That's how they do it in the field. Like every complete survey response, you have to pay the participant to fill out the survey, and of course you have to pay the agency as well for their having collected the panel of respondents. And so, in order to get the representative survey, it's going to be somewhere between maybe $3,000 and $5,000. And so if people want to contribute to ensuring that the book happens, that the survey occurs, and that we are able to kind of quantify, do this work of understanding and quantifying spiritual experiences among the members of the church, then you can make a contribution there to the work.
Great. Was there anything else you wanted to cover before I let you go?
Yeah, I think we did a pretty great job.
Okay, this is great. Now I'm going to do this because I do this. Evangelicals come to me frequently and say, "You're doing something very different, Steve. You're because many evangelicals watch my channel to learn about the restoration, and some of them are trying to do it for proselytizing or they're just interested in it, and many of them want to engage the restoration individuals of the members of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and they say, how do I go about this? How am I to have these conversations rather than the confrontational ones that we see from these others that are doing stuff that I don't really like. And so I tell them, ask them 3 questions. So I, as an evangelical, are going to ask you the 3 questions. Are you ready?
Yeah.
I sprung this on you. I didn't worry, but I love to do this because it's
I don't know what they're going to be.
Okay, this is great. You got to watch my show more. Either way, okay, here we are. Here's the 3 questions. Number 1, what is your favorite Book of Mormon story?
Okay. So my favorite story is the story of the sons of Helaman, and the reason why is because when I was there was one day, maybe I don't know, 7 years ago or something like that, when I was walking from the train to the office building, and en route, I was just listening to the scriptures, and this story was being told, was being described. And in this verse, when it described how the sons of Helaman had all received deep wounds, but that none of them had perished, I had this overwhelming spiritual experience that I'd read this story dozens of times in my life, and for some reason, it was like God wanted me to know these people lived, these people were real. That's how I felt. And that was really strange for me because I had kind of come to a place in my faith journey where trying to balance the intellect, like I had kind of explained the Book of Mormon in more naturalistic terms, and I wasn't sure whether it was legitimate, real, real stories about real people. And I just had this overwhelming sense that was just like a wash over me. And I just started crying because it was so powerful that these people, this story happened, these people were real. And so, like, I treasure that experience, that it's the reason why I continue to believe that the Book of Mormon is scripture, because God spoke to me through that story.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay, this is great. Well, this ties in perfectly with what we were talking about. So this is great. So question number 2 is, what is your favorite Bible story?
Oh, there's so many.
It's okay. Take your time. Something's going to pop in your head.
I think probably, even though it's heartbreaking, I think my favorite might be the story of Abraham and Isaac, just for its illustration of the parallel between our relationship uh, with between the relationship of the father and the son with each other, and the relationship that that we have with the son as well. That he asks of us to make this sacrifice of giving up our lives on the altar, and that he sometimes saves us from having to give up every aspect of our lives. Sometimes he allows us to keep a little bit of ourselves, but we have to be willing to lay everything, every aspect on the altar. And I find that that parallel um, helps keep me grounded when I feel like, oh, it's too much. He's asking too much. The commandments are too hard or something like that. It helps me to remember, like, these people, like God gave up all when he gave his son, and Abraham gave up all when he gave up Isaac, and I need to be willing to give up all for the Lord as well. So.
Okay, well, that segues perfectly into the final question, and that is, who is Jesus to you?
Mm. Um, when I started studying psychology, I was in school for like nearly 10 years of college. And to get a PhD, oh gosh, it's so much work. It takes so long. But when I was in school, I started almost from the very beginning with experiences, naturalistic explanations that kind of sparked in me faith crises. Um, Sometimes they were prolonged, sometimes they were short, sometimes I could explain them, I could come up with a spiritual explanation to kind of like keep me grounded. But I spent most of those 10 years while I was in school struggling with the compelling force of atheism. I was so torn. I really desperately wanted to not believe in God because the explanations were so compelling, it felt to me, from the naturalistic side. But the one thing that I could never get past was when I would kneel down and pray for forgiveness through the atonement of Jesus Christ, I felt cleansed. I felt cleansed of really awful things that I had done, things that I felt an immense amount of guilt over. And I had these before, and I had these during, and I've had these since, where I've knelt down and I've just asked for forgiveness. And that has come. And that has always been one of the most undeniable spiritual experiences of my life. Just this repeated forgiveness, this feeling of being cleansed, this feeling that I can't come up with personally a psychological explanation for, to ask the air, if there is no God, to just put out in the air a request for forgiveness, to feel plagued by sin for months and months and months, and all of a sudden to feel like it's all washed away, like it's all wiped clean. I have no explanation for that except that Jesus is the real deal, that he really came, that he really did what what his mission was, and that he can cleanse us. And I just believe that because I felt the effects of it. I also, just even as recently as just 11 months ago, just 11 months and 8 days ago, I joined Overeaters Anonymous because I was addicted to food. I had been an overeater much of my life. And after joining the program, you make this connection with God, you have a spiritual transformation, and it heals you of your addiction. And it was like the day I joined, the day I recommitted my life to God and just gave my will over to him, it was like he took from me all the desire for unhealthy food and changed my nature, made me a healthy person. I no longer have cravings for sweets. I don't eat desserts. I don't eat anything between meals. I have like just a very rigid standard there where, I have 4 meals a day. And between those meals, I never eat anything else. I never eat snack food, never eat desserts or anything like that. But I don't have the temptation to anymore because it feels to me like Christ changed my nature. He made me a new person, a different person than I had always been in my whole life. And it's for that reason that I believe in him, and that I think he is the of course he will save me eventually from death, but he saves me every day from sin and from the effects of that in my everyday life.
Wow, very powerful. I want to thank you so much, Jesse James, for sharing that with my audience. I wasn't expecting to get so personal, but I think it's really instructive. I think it's very helpful to the audience to hear these stories. Again, this is an example of evangelicals. What do you make of what you just heard? Doesn't it sound very, very familiar to you? Doesn't it almost sound like he's going through a sanctification process, maybe from those of you in the holiness tradition. I don't know. I don't know what to make of this sometimes, but I don't care. I just want this out there. And I want us to ponder these things, think about them. And I want also Christians pray about this stuff too. I want you to sincerely go to God and say, am I dealing with other Christians? Are these people worshiping another Jesus? Or does it sound all too familiar that it sounds to me like when you talk about the forgiveness and the feeling, the sense of forgiveness that you get, that's pretty remarkable stuff, dude. And so, like I said, like you said earlier, don't put God in a box. Don't put him in a box, folks, because he can operate in radical ways beyond anything, beyond any human understanding. And that's how I operate as well. So for those of you who want to put God in a box, I know you don't like me, but that's okay, because you're in the place where you got to be, and that's fine too. But I also want to tell you, Jesus loves you. And I love you all in my audience. And Jesse, I love you. I appreciate you coming on the program today.
It's a pleasure to be here.
So I just want to remind those of you, if you would like to financially support the channel, there'll be links in the description for PayPal and Patreon. Also, don't forget our merch store. We have hot chocolate mugs. We have ball caps. We have tons of things. Check out MormonBookReviews.com. Don't forget to enter this month's book contest. We will also have links in the description for everything that Jesse talked about today. But just remember, the most important thing, folks, is this. All the voices of the restoration will be heard here on Mormon Book Reviews.